August 21st, 1945. The morning light came slowly across the northern coast of Guam, soft and pale, as though it wasn't yet certain the war was truly over. The sun barely lifted above the horizon when the first American trucks rumbled into the processing area, their engines humming with the tired confidence of men who had lived too long on the edge of violence. The Pacific breeze carried a mix of salt, diesel, and the distant cry of seabirds. But beneath all of that, faint yet unmistakable, there was another smell, the earthy scent of unwashed bodies, sweat soaked into ragged uniforms, and the stale hunger of men who had gone far past the point where hunger becomes pain. The Japanese prisoners of war were marched in slow, uneven lines toward the intake station. Some limped, some staggered. A few needed the support of the men beside them. Their faces were hollow, cheeks drawn tight, eyes sunken, lips cracked from weeks of rationless hiding before surrender. Many no longer looked like soldiers, but like shadows wearing uniforms that no longer fit them. Private Kenji Nakamura walked near the center of the procession. 22 years old, barely able to keep his shoulders straight. His uniform hung off him like something borrowed from a dead man, loose around the waist, threadbare at the knees, stiff with salt from his own dried sweat. His boots had lost their soles days earlier. He had tied strips of cloth around his feet to keep the dirt from grinding into open cracks. And yet he walked with a quiet, stubborn dignity, because that was the last thing he still possessed. The war had taken everything else. As the prisoners approached the American tents, Kenji felt his heartbeat rise sharply. The sight of the enemy in full control, armed, fed, rested, made something inside his stomach twist tighter than hunger. This was the moment he had been raised to fear. The moment when the enemy would reveal his true nature. The stories drilled into him during training echoed through his mind. Americans were brutal. They laughed while torturing prisoners. They shot men who walked too slowly. They mocked honor and despised surrender. Everything in him braced for humiliation. And yet, when the first American guard approached, he didn't shout. He didn't lift his rifle. He simply held up his palm and said, in a steady, almost casual voice, "Line forms here. Take it slow." Kenji blinked, confused. The guard was young, no older than 25, with sun-browned skin, a jawline covered in faint stubble, and eyes that looked more tired than angry. He guided the prisoners into a shaded area with measured, practiced gestures. There was no anger in his movements, no contempt, just routine. That alone unsettled Kenji more deeply than shouting would have. A medic hurried over next, carrying a canteen and a clipboard under his arm. His uniform bore stains from iodine, sweat, and grease pencil. Without speaking, he approached one of the prisoners, a man so thin his bones looked sharp beneath his skin, and pressed 2 fingers against his neck, checking his pulse. He gestured to another American nearby. "Get water, he's going down," the medic said. The second American rushed toward a stack of metal canteens. Kenji felt his breath catch. They were helping him, helping a Japanese soldier, not ignoring him, not sneering, not striking him for weakness, helping. That wasn't supposed to be possible. When the medic moved to him, Kenji stiffened, prepared for violence. But the man simply lifted his wrist, examined the pale, thread-like veins beneath his skin, and pressed his thumb against Kenji's pulse. "Malnourished. Dehydration. Probable anemia," the medic muttered under his breath. Then, glancing at Kenji, he added, "You'll be all right." The words were meaningless to Kenji. He understood none of them, but the tone was gentle, almost reassuring. He lowered his eyes quickly, fighting the instinct to bow. Behind him, someone collapsed. A young Japanese soldier who had marched with visible pain for miles. Kenji spun around instinctively, expecting to hear a gunshot. Instead, 2 Americans rushed forward and lifted the soldier under each arm, carefully, as though lifting a wounded comrade. Kenji felt his chest tighten painfully. He didn't understand any of this. They had lost the war. They were the defeated enemy. And yet the Americans treated them like something closer to Humans. He whispered to himself, barely audible. Nani? Kore wa? What is this? The next stage was the showers. The Japanese prisoners hesitated, believing they were being stripped for punishment or humiliation. But the Americans simply handed them thin towels and pointed them toward the rows of water pipes. When the first prisoner stepped under the stream, the water poured out warm water. The man gasped, not from heat, but from shock. He touched his chest with trembling fingers, watching the dirt melt away in thick brown streams. The man looked as though he might cry, but he clenched his jaw to stop it. One by one, the others stepped in. Kenji stood beneath the water last. The moment it hit his skin, he let out a shaking breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The warmth seeped through him, loosening muscles that had been stiff for weeks. Dirt ran off in rivers, revealing bruises he didn't even remember receiving. His hair softened as the water freed it from salt and grime. When he stepped out, an American handed him a folded uniform. Clean, soft, marked with PW in thick black letters. Kenji ran his fingers over the fabric. He had not worn anything this clean since leaving home. He clutched the uniform tightly, as if the softness of it might disappear if he loosened his grip. And then the smell reached him. It drifted gently from the field kitchen, warm, rich, unmistakable. Something fatty, something savoury. Something cooked, food, real food, not roots dug from the jungle, not mouldy rice saved for days, not grass boiled in desperation. Food. The prisoners were led to long wooden tables beneath an open-sided canopy. Metal trays had been placed in neat rows. The Americans stood behind a serving line, ladles in hand, aprons tied loosely around their waists. The Japanese prisoners froze again. Was this another inspection? A chore? A staged humiliation? Then an American guard pointed at the tables and said slowly, clearly, "Eat. Food. For you." The interpreter translated, but he didn't need to. The meaning was too obvious. Some of the prisoners didn't move. Some stepped forward, as though walking into a dream. Kenji approached the serving line with his heart hammering. A cook with a deep tan and tired eyes scooped mashed potatoes onto his tray, then a slice of canned ham, green beans, 2 pieces of soft bread. Bread again. Bread. Kenji bowed instinctively. The cook blinked, startled, then nodded politely. Kenji sat. Around him, dozens of men stared at their trays, afraid to begin. Then Sergeant Major Fujita, the oldest among them, lifted a piece of bread to his lips and inhaled sharply. His knees trembled. Then, suddenly, he bit into it. His eyes filled instantly. That was enough. The others followed. Kenji lifted a spoonful of potatoes to his mouth. Warmth, softness, salt, fat, flavor. It was unreal, almost frightening. His body reacted before thought. He ate faster, then slowed himself down, ashamed of his desperation. Tears blurred his vision. He wiped them quickly, hoping no one saw. But around him, men sobbed quietly as they ate. For minutes, the only sounds were chewing, soft weeping, and the clink of metal against metal. No one spoke. And when Kenji finally exhaled, his throat tightening around a breath he had held for months, he understood something terrifying. Nothing he had been taught about the Americans was aligning with reality. The enemy was feeding them, healing them, clothing them, treating them like men. And that, the realization itself, was almost harder to process than the food. The first American meal wasn't simply sustenance. It was a fracture, a disruption, the first crack in a lifetime of indoctrinated belief. As the meal settled heavy and warm in his stomach, Kenji felt the world quietly tilt, rearranging itself into something unrecognizable. And deep inside him, beneath the fear and confusion and exhaustion, something small and fragile stirred. Hope. He tried to extinguish it, but it lodged itself stubbornly in his chest. He didn't yet know that this meal would change him forever. He only knew that he had tasted something he would never forget. Not just food, but mercy. and mercy, he realized, could be more overwhelming than hunger. The next morning broke with a gentle warmth that spread across the American compound, settling on the canvas tents and the lines of barbed wire glinting faintly in the early sun. Kenji Nakamura woke before most of the men around him, stirred not by nightmares, those had finally loosened their grip, but by a low hum in the air that reminded him of ships moving at harbour. For a moment he didn't know where he was. The absence of gunfire, the absence of hunger pains sharp enough to wake him, these things felt foreign. He sat up slowly, listening. There were voices, American voices, calm, unhurried, indistinct. The clatter of metal trays, the slow grind of a generator, the rhythmic thump of boots moving in formation somewhere beyond the tents. No shouting, no barking orders, no snapping of whips or blows. Just routine. As Kenji rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he noticed the man beside him, Private Sato, sitting upright, staring into nothing. His cheeks were sunken, his jaw sharp enough to look painful. But his eyes were brighter than they had been the day before. "You slept," Kenji whispered. Sato nodded once. "For the first time," he murmured. I don't know." Kenji nodded. He didn't know either. Time had dissolved long before surrender. A sudden wave of warm, rich scent drifted toward them, the unmistakable smell of something cooking, fat sizzling, bread warming, some kind of meat heating in pans. The men around them stirred like ghosts returning to bodies. Kenji's stomach tightened, not from pain this time, but from memory. The meal yesterday had filled him, but it had also awakened something dangerous. Anticipation. He tried to disguise it, but hunger wasn't something a man could hide easily, not in a place like this. They rose when the American guard signaled, though again, there were no rifles pointed directly at them, no harsh threats. The guards walked alongside the line, watchful but not hostile, guiding the prisoners toward the clearing where breakfast was being prepared. Kenji's eyes followed the cooks, 3 Americans in aprons and rolled sleeves, moving around large metal pans heated over portable stoves. One ladled a thick yellow mixture into a skillet. Another flipped what looked like soft, doughy cakes. A third stirred something in a large pot that released a sweet, unfamiliar aroma into the air. The Japanese prisoners watched, confused, trying to identify each movement through the fog of their own assumptions. One older soldier whispered, "This is too much. They don't feed enemies like this." But reality contradicted him. The line moved, slow but steady, and when Kenji reached the front, an American cook, with a reassuringly calm expression, pointed at each food item for clarity. "Eggs," he said, placing a generous portion on the tray. "Pancakes." 3 small ones slid beside the eggs. "Fruit." A scoop of canned peaches glistened in syrup. And bread. Bread again. Warm. Soft. Fresh. Kenji swallowed hard. He bowed automatically before stepping aside with his tray, his instincts overriding everything else. The cook blinked, unsure what to do, then nodded back out of courtesy. Kenji sat at one of the wooden benches. Around him, the prisoners stared at their food again, just as they had the day before, just as uncertain, just as overwhelmed. But this time, the hesitation lasted only seconds before they began to eat. Sato inhaled sharply after his first bite of pancake. "It's sweet," he whispered, astonished. "They eat sweet things in the morning." Kenji took a bite of his own. The texture was soft, almost airy, with a flavour he couldn't place. Flour, milk, something else. He chewed slowly, savouring it. The eggs were warm and soft, unlike anything he had tasted during the war, and the peaches, bright, sweet, and easy to swallow, nearly broke him. When he swallowed, he felt something loosen inside his chest. It wasn't just food, it was restoration. It was acknowledgement. It was the first taste of being treated as alive, not as an enemy. The meal lasted longer than the one before. The Japanese prisoners ate more slowly, as though afraid to waste even a moment tasting something so foreign and comforting. Around them, American soldiers ate similar meals at separate tables nearby, talking casually, laughing, trading stories. The Japanese watched them, not with envy, but with an indescribable confusion. They were eating the same food, not scraps, not inferior rations, not punishment meals. The same. Sato leaned closer. Do they not hate us? Kenji didn't know how to answer. After breakfast, they were escorted to the center of the compound, where an American officer waited beneath a shade canopy. Beside him stood a Nisei interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier wearing US khaki, his face carrying an odd mix of familiarity and foreignness. His eyes were sharp but gentle, and when he spoke Japanese, the words came out with the fluency of someone raised in two cultures at once. You will now proceed with work assignments, he translated. These tasks are not punishment. They are routine duties to maintain order, health, and cleanliness in the camp. Many of the prisoners exchanged skeptical glances. Routine duties? That sounded almost reasonable. The officer continued speaking in English. The interpreter translated. You will not be forced to perform heavy labor. If your medical check yesterday showed weakness or illness, you will rest. If you are able, you will help with light tasks. A murmur spread among the prisoners. Light tasks, not the brutal portage or trench digging they had expected. When work assignments were divided, Kenji raised his hand voluntarily. He didn't fully understand why. Perhaps he wanted movement. Perhaps he wanted distraction. Perhaps he simply wanted to prove to himself that he still served some purpose beyond survival. He was assigned to a group tasked with clearing debris along the edge of the camp where an old supply crate had collapsed. The Japanese prisoners worked in quiet coordination, lifting broken planks and carrying them to a pile near the perimeter. The American overseeing them, a tall sergeant with a tired expression, gave clear instructions through gestures, his tone even. No shouting, no insults, no blows. When one prisoner struggled to move a heavy beam, the sergeant stepped forward, braced his boots in the dirt, and lifted one end without hesitation. Together, they moved it aside. Something inside Kenji shifted watching that gesture. Assistance, not dominance. Cooperation, not cruelty. It made the world feel tilted. At midday, they were given water and allowed to rest under the shade of palm trees. The air smelled of salt and drying wood. Kenji leaned back against the trunk of a tree, letting the rough bark press into his spine. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint rumble of waves breaking somewhere beyond the perimeter. Kenji, Sato said quietly, settling beside him. Do you think they will send us home soon? Kenji opened his eyes slowly. The question hit something deep inside him. Home. He hadn't let himself think the word, not aloud, not even in the privacy of his own mind. I don't know, he replied softly. But they have not treated us as I feared. Sato stared at his hands. I thought they would kill us when we surrendered, or starve us, or worse. Kenji nodded. He had believed the same. Every soldier had. Sato's voice dropped. I don't understand this. Kenji didn't either, but he had seen something yesterday. Something in the way the medic examined him with concern, in the way the cook nodded back, in the way the guards flowed through the camp without venom. The Americans didn't treat them like monsters, and they didn't treat themselves like heroes. They behaved as though this, feeding, clothing, healing prisoners, was their duty. It was disorienting. Later in the afternoon, the prisoners were assembled again under a larger tent for a briefing. An American lieutenant stepped forward, with the Nisei interpreter beside him. You are no longer combatants, the lieutenant said. The war is over. You will be transferred soon to a more permanent camp. Kenji watched the interpreter carefully. The young man's voice remained steady, but not harsh. His Japanese was standard, clear, free of judgment. You will receive mail. You will be assigned work suited to your health. You will not be harmed. A low, stunned murmur passed through the group. Male. The idea pierced Kenji's chest like a blade. He had spent months believing his family dead. The thought that he might write to them, that they might be alive to read his letter, felt impossible. Some prisoners bowed their heads. Others wiped their eyes discreetly. A few whispered questions the interpreter patiently answered. Then came the final message from the lieutenant, translated carefully. Your primary duty now is to survive and to prepare for life after the war. The words hung in the air. Life after the war. For so long, the only future any of them imagined was death. Now someone was telling them they still had a place in the world. After the briefing, Kenji sat alone for a long time near the boundary rope, watching the palm trees shift in the breeze. His thoughts wandered, back to the meal, the warmth of the shower, the softness of the uniform, the unexpected humanity in the Americans' behavior. These were small things, ordinary things, but ordinary things had become extraordinary. He felt the interpreter's presence before he heard him approach. The Japanese-American soldier stopped a few feet away, hands tucked loosely in his pockets. You're eating well, the interpreter said gently. Kenji nodded. Yes. You look better today. Kenji lowered his gaze. I don't know why they treat us like this. I don't understand. The interpreter exhaled softly. Because the war is over, he replied. Because you're prisoners, not enemies now. Because these men were taught to follow rules, even when it hurts. And because... He hesitated. Because many of them want the world to be different after all this. Kenji looked up. Different? Yes, the interpreter said quietly. What happened can't continue forever. Someone has to stop the cycle. Kenji wasn't sure he believed that, but he wanted to. The interpreter looked toward the sea, then back at Kenji with a faint, almost sad smile. You'll see, this is only the beginning. Only the beginning. The idea lingered as the day faded into evening. Later, when dinner was served, another simple but generous meal, Kenji ate slower, tasting every bite, trying to understand each flavor, each gesture, each quiet moment of civility. The Americans weren't giving them luxury. They weren't spoiling them. They were giving them normalcy, and normalcy itself felt like a gift. As night fell and the men settled again beneath the canvas shelter, Kenji lay awake for a while, staring at the shadowed ceiling above. He felt the soft ache of a full stomach, the faint soreness of muscles used for labor, the heaviness of exhaustion that was not fear-driven for once. He closed his eyes slowly. He didn't dream of home. He didn't dream of death. This time, he dreamed of nothing, just dark, quiet rest. And though he didn't know it yet, that was its own kind of healing. The third day on Guam began with a sky washed in soft grey, the kind of morning light that made everything look gentler than it truly was. A faint mist hovered over the palm trees along the perimeter, and for a moment the entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Kenji Nakamura woke slowly, as though resurfacing from deep water. His body ached, not with sharp hunger, not with fear, but with the soreness of work and sleep and existence. A normal ache, the kind he remembered from his youth, when he helped his father repair nets or carried buckets of fish to the market at dawn. For the first time since the surrender, he felt the distant echo of something he hadn't dared acknowledge. Life. He blinked into the dimness of the shelter. Around him, the other Japanese prisoners stirred in muted waves, stretching, murmuring softly, rubbing their faces, adjusting their blankets. No one jolted awake in panic. No one clung to their canteen in fear of it being stolen. No one cried quietly believing they might not see another sunrise. The stillness was unsettling. Peace, when it arrived suddenly, did not feel like peace. It felt like disorientation. Kenji, a voice whispered to his left. He turned to see Private Sato sitting up, his thin hands clasped tightly in his lap. You slept again, Sato said, almost accusingly. Kenji nodded. So did you. Sato's eyes drifted toward the open side of the shelter where the morning haze drifted through. His expression wavered. It feels wrong, he murmured, to sleep this easily, to wake like this. Kenji understood. Comfort was a type of shock. And comfort given by the enemy felt like contradiction itself. Before he could respond, the scent arrived, the smell that quieted every whisper, every movement, every lingering doubt. Warm bread, cooking fat, something sweet, maybe fruit, something sharp, maybe brewed coffee. Breakfast. Even after 2 generous meals, none of the prisoners moved casually toward the smell. Hunger still ruled their instincts. Hunger and disbelief. They rose as if called by an invisible hand, gathering themselves into a line that formed slowly, but without chaos. American guards watched them from a respectful distance, rifles slung but not aimed. One guard nodded once toward the line, a silent instruction to proceed. The prisoners walked toward the mess tent. Inside, the cooks moved with methodical efficiency. Large tins of something golden, scrambled eggs, though Kenji still thought of them as strange, soft clouds, sat on the serving counter. Pancakes were stacked, not flat and brittle like Japanese war rations, but thick and warm, as if they held air inside. Beside them sat metal trays piled with apples and canned pears. The Japanese prisoners did not speak. Their silence had become a language of its own. Kenji stepped forward. When his turn came, a cook spooned eggs onto his tray, then fruit, then a small square of cornbread. The sweetness from the cornbread hit his senses like memory of a memory. Something distant, something childhood-like. He bowed out of instinct, and the cook gave a small, awkward nod in return. When Kenji sat down, he did not eat immediately. He waited, just for a moment, watching the faces around him. Men who had lived in caves, men who had eaten leaves to survive, men who had dug trenches with their bare hands when shovels were gone. Men who had expected death to come by rifle, blade, or starvation. Now they lifted pieces of cornbread and examined it with the same intensity they once used to examine maps before a battle. He took his first bite and felt the warmth travel down his throat like something medicinal. He ate slowly, carefully, savouring each spoonful as though it were a fragile thing. Across from him, Sato whispered, "How can they give us this? Why? Why this much?" Kenji didn't know, but each time he tasted something soft or sweet or warm, he felt the question linger in the back of his throat, like an unanswered ache. After breakfast, the prisoners were gathered again under a large shade canopy. The Nisei interpreter stood beside an American lieutenant, a clipboard tucked under the officer's arm. The interpreter's voice carried gently across the seated prisoners. "You will be transported soon. Not today, but soon." A murmur went through the group. Fear, curiosity, hope tangled together in one breath. "First," the interpreter continued, "more medical checks will be done, and letters will be prepared." Letters. The word alone struck some of the men like a physical blow. A man in the back gasped aloud. Another pressed his hands to his face. One man began to cry openly, not from weakness, but from a relief so deep it cracked him apart. Kenji felt his breath catch. The thought of writing to his mother to tell her he was alive felt impossible. War had made him believe that the oceans themselves had swallowed the world he came from. But now... He leaned forward as the interpreter continued, "You may write, but the letters will be inspected. They must follow regulations. You will be given paper. You will write your name, your rank, where you are held, your health. You may send hope. You may not send fear." Some men laughed softly through tears. The idea of sending anything at all felt like a miracle. After the briefing, Kenji returned to the rest area, carrying his canteen. He sat in silence, staring at the dirt, trying to find the courage to let the idea of hope take shape. As the day progressed, they were split into groups for various tasks. Kenji's assignment was to help repair torn canvas used for temporary storage tents. The work was simple. Thread needle through thick fabric, pull, tie. But it required focus. He sat cross-legged with 3 other prisoners, each stitching in quiet concentration. An American sergeant walked by, stopped, and squatted beside Kenji. He pointed at Kenji's stitching technique, mimed a smoother motion, then nodded approvingly when Kenji adjusted his grip. Kenji felt heat rise in his chest, approval from the enemy, not praise, but acknowledgement of competence, something he had not received from his own officers in months. Later, when the sun climbed high overhead, the American guards handed out water and allowed the men to rest under the palm trees. Kenji found Sato sitting with his back against a trunk, staring at the sky through swaying fronds. "What will you write?" Sato asked quietly. Kenji lowered his head. "I don't know if my family survived." Sato nodded. "None of us know." There was no bitterness in his voice, only emptiness. Kenji breathed slowly. "If I write, I will tell them I am alive, and that the enemy," he hesitated, "that the Americans have not treated us cruelly." Sato's eyes flickered. "Do you think they will believe that?" "I don't know," Kenji admitted. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then came a sound that shattered the quiet, the low drone of an approaching truck. Several prisoners tensed, assuming the worst, but the truck merely rolled to a stop beside the main tent. A group of American medics climbed out, carrying equipment boxes and medical supplies. Medical rechecks. Kenji's group was called first. Inside the medical tent, the air was cooler, shaded, and smelled faintly of antiseptic. A medic gestured for Kenji to sit on a folding stool. He examined Kenji's chest with a stethoscope, checked his gums for signs of severe deficiency, and pressed gently on his abdomen to feel for swelling. Kenji flinched only once, when the medic applied disinfectant to an older wound near his ribs that had not healed properly. "Almost infected," the medic muttered. "Good thing you surrendered when you did." Kenji didn't understand the words, but he recognized the concern behind them. The medic wrapped the wound neatly, securing it with careful pressure. Before dismissing him, the medic placed a packet of something in Kenji's hand, a small pouch with a picture of oranges on it. Kenji stared at it, confused. The interpreter approached. "Vitamin C," he explained, "for your health." Kenji bowed, not because he was commanded to, because his body moved on instinct, overwhelmed. Outside, Sato waited. When he saw the packet, he whispered, "They gave you medicine?" Kenji nodded. Sato exhaled shakily. "This is nothing like what I imagined." "Nor I," Kenji replied. They returned to the shade area as the heat grew heavier. By afternoon, the compound hummed with quiet routines. Americans cleaning rifles, engineers repairing a generator, guards walking perimeter shifts. The Japanese prisoners performed their tasks, rested, whispered among themselves. But something subtle had begun to change. Not in the Americans, in the prisoners. Their posture had shifted, maybe slightly, but enough for Kenji to notice. They no longer moved like men awaiting punishment. They moved like men waiting for something else, something more abstract and terrifying. A future. As the sun dipped lower, turning the camp gold, an American guard approached Kenji's group with a metal box. "Paper, pencils," he said, pointing. The interpreter repeated it in Japanese. For a moment, the prisoners froze. Then slowly, reverently, they reached for the small slips of paper and short pencils, each man holding the items with trembling hands. Kenji sat under a palm tree, placed the paper on his knee, and stared at the blank page. What does a man say when he returns from the dead? He began slowly. "My dearest mother." He paused, exhaling as the sudden swell of emotion nearly overtook him. "I am alive." His writing was shaky, his hands trembled, but each word felt like a step across a bridge he never thought he'd reach. Sato wrote beside him, tears slipping silently down his cheeks as he formed the characters for his wife's name. Around them, men wept without shame. Some wrote quickly, Some wrote only one line. Some wrote nothing at all, staring at the page because the world inside their hearts was too heavy for ink. Before collecting the letters, the interpreter walked through the group, offering quiet help to those who struggled. When he reached Kenji, he knelt beside him. "You wrote," the interpreter said softly. Kenji nodded. "Yes." "Good." The interpreter touched the page gently. "Your family will know you live." Kenji could not speak. His throat tightened, and he bowed his head deeply. When the letters were gathered, the men sat in silence, drained but lighter. Dinner came soon after. Another warm meal, simple but generous. Rice mixed with vegetables. A small portion of meat. Bread. Always bread. The prisoners ate slower, more thoughtfully. Something about writing letters had shifted them internally. They were no longer ghosts in a strange land. They were men tethered again to people far across the sea. After the meal, night fell, warm and soothing. The lamps glowed softly along the pathways. The guards paced a little farther back, giving the prisoners more space. Kenji returned to his mat beneath the shelter. The air felt thicker, heavier, but peaceful. As he lay down, staring up at the dark canvas roof, he let his mind drift. Not to fear, not to hunger, not to guilt, but to tomorrow. Because tomorrow would bring another meal, another routine, another reminder that he was still alive. The first American meal had broken the hunger. The second had broken the confusion. The third, and everything after, broke something deeper. It broke the idea that kindness could never come from the enemy. It broke the belief that mercy was weakness. It broke the certainty that surrender meant the end of self. It replaced all of that with something far more dangerous. Hope. Soft, quiet, uninvited. But hope all the same. And as Kenji drifted into sleep, he whispered a single thought he had not allowed himself since the war began. I might live long enough to see home again. Not because he deserved it, but because the world, somehow, had changed. And the first American meal had been the moment everything began to shift.